So welcome back. We're just gone for 5 minutes, but we're re-recording our session that we did last time on happiness, perspective, and gratitude because we had some audio issues, and we've got some feedback that people really liked it. So for the couple that were here, and so we want to make sure that we share this with you because this is, I think personally, one of the most powerful practices you can do in your daily life to kind of improve yourself as a human, and then to improve your family and your community around you by practicing happiness. So with that, we'll get started. So what we talked about a little bit in our very first service was kind of our purpose, which is to advance humanity and to make it better as we go along. But to do that, we have to kind of be solid as individuals first, right? We're always going to be a work in progress, but there's kind of this axiom: you have to put your own house in order before you look to help someone else. And so doing that is kind of difficult if you're not happy. But we have a lot of misconceptions about what happiness is, how to get it, and then how to maintain it over time. So there's a lot of research on this now, and I want to share some of it with you. And once we get done with this and post it, I'll put all the links to some of the research that I found, so you can kind of look at it yourself, right? So it's one of the things that we want to promote is skepticism, and people asking questions and looking into the details to see if I'm blowing smoke or not, right? So, and to make sure that we're keeping each other honest as we go forward. And so, that pursuit of happiness, right? We have built into, in America, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So happiness is a pursuit in the sense that, or people think it's a pursuit in that you have to go and find something, or you find happiness, or you get it, you collect it like a thing. But a lot of the research today shows that it is not that. That you can't pursue happiness, you have to make it. And that's a fundamental shift that a lot of people don't quite get. They don't learn in their life. And a lot of the materialistic marketing in today's society really causes us to think otherwise. So I want to share some things with you that might offer you a different perspective on happiness and how to live that life. So we'll start with a rhetorical quiz. If you had the choice between being a paraplegic, so being basically paralyzed from the neck down, or winning the lottery, and you had to pick which one would be happier after a year, which one would you think it would be? So think about that to yourself. Do you think the person who was paralyzed would be happier after a year, or the person who had won the lottery? So, research actually shows that after a year, both people are equally happy. Now that's a really crazy thing to consider, right? Someone who gets in an accident, who all of their limbs are paralyzed, is the same happiness as the person who wins the lottery. Now what does that tell you? I'm sure that for the person who wins the lottery, there's definitely an initial bump in their happiness based on what they think they've won. And for the person who gets in an accident, there's definitely a lowering of happiness for them because they've just gone through something terrible. But then after a year, it returns to the same level. Why is that? So a researcher and scientist by the name of Dan Gilbert theorizes that we have this happiness immune system. That we have sort of this baseline happiness that, barring any major shift in what we do in our daily life and practicing it, we're going to kind of return to no matter what. People that have bad things happen to them do tend to return to their happiness, and they tend to be able to cope with it, right? And so it's that immune system that allows us to continue on with our lives after dealing with sadness, right? So a sickness of happiness, if you want to call it that, that allows us to get back to being a productive member and being able to take care of ourselves. So that's a really incredible thing, but it also means that happiness isn't something you get, right? So if you accept that premise, happiness isn't something you just go out and get, right? Just like your immune system, you can get boosters that help you deal with certain things, but a lot of times it's actually the practice, right? So your body practices fending off a sickness, so you can practice fending off sadness or handling it. And so that means that we have to shift away from that getting happiness to building happiness. And we'll talk some more specifically about some different elements of research that support that idea. And so they found for these people who are paralyzed lottery winners, it takes about 3 months or a year to recover to that baseline level. So I would say for those of you out there who are going through something difficult, once you get through that difficult thing, right? If it's long, right? So if you're going through it for months and months and months, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to recover before it's over. But realize that once you get through it, you will be able to recover that level of happiness, that level of joy that you once had. Particularly if you practice and follow some things we're going to talk about today. But realize that there is always a light at the end of the tunnel, regardless of how long the tunnel is, once you get past that sort of pain. But sometimes it means making tough decisions to get you out of the situation where your happiness level is depressed and put down. And so that can be a challenging thing. And then here's the other thing. There's an analogy out there called crabs in a bucket. And so when you catch crabs, you put them in a bucket and you bring them back to cook them, right? And crabs could get out of the bucket, right? So any one crab standing on the other crabs could probably get out of the bucket. The interesting thing, though, is that the crabs in the bucket pull the other crabs down. And so none of the crabs get out. And this analogy basically relates to if I'm suffering, then everyone else should suffer. Or kind of extrapolate a little bit is that this idea that I might not deserve to be happy because other people are unhappy around me, right? And so a question I would ask for people to consider is, for the most part, would we ever tell somebody else that they don't deserve to be happy? Would we ever say that out loud to somebody else? I don't think most of us would, I think by and large. And so what that means is for ourselves, we often have to allow ourselves to be happy. We have to give ourselves permission to be happy, to enjoy life, to find and build that happiness and build that strength in ourselves. Because a lot of times we get stuck in our own heads, right? Earlier, just before the video, we were talking about building community. And a lot of times for humanists or non-believers, atheists, agnostics, we tend to be a little bit more isolated, a little bit more individual. And so it can be the case that we are kind of alone, or we feel alone. And we get stuck in our head and we question whether or not we deserve happiness. And I would say unequivocally the answer is yes. But we have to give ourselves permission to do it. We have to allow ourselves to be happy. And that can often be the first step, and a really tough one, to achieving that happiness. So there's an author, Tim Ferriss, a good author, I recommend him. And I was listening to one of his podcasts, and he said, I struggle with being successful and being happy because I have this internal narrative to myself, this internal discussion that is so mean and so negative to myself that I say things to myself that I would never, ever, ever say out loud to anybody else, ever. Thinking that I'm stupid, that I'm not worthy, that I'm lazy, that I'm hypocritical. And it's this constant narrative that I have going. And every once in a while, I realize it, he says. I realize it and I say, I would never say this to anyone else, so why would I say it to myself? Why would I put myself in that situation where I'm running myself down, right? So let's give ourselves a little bit of space and a little bit of an allowance to make errors and not be perfect, right? Because none of us are, and we're all a work in progress. And so we'll get into the science now, but what this is really about is hacking your brain and hacking yourself, right? Figuring out ways that you can make yourself better by either manipulating what's around you or even just practicing things to yourself that cause you to your habit patterns and your thinking patterns to change. And it's a very powerful thing. So, Laurie Santos is a professor at Yale. She has created the most popular course in Yale's history, and that's a course on happiness. You can actually take this course. I'll put it in the links at the bottom. So it's on Coursera. There's like a limited version of the course that you can take. There's a happiness inventory. It's a little test that you can take as a pre-test and a post-test. But it talks about how to be happy. And the first part of the course talks about how we're wrong about going about being happy. A lot of people have these concepts in their head that if only I had the better job, I would be happy. Or if only I got that promotion. Or if only I was able to do this in my life, then I would be happy. And research actually shows that that isn't true. So there's another researcher, so TED Talk, his name is Sean Achor, it's called The Happy Secret to Better Work. And he shows that through performance-based studies, that people who are happier work better, and not that people who have the right job or the promotion are happier. So if I put that a different way, happier people are better at work, but better work, according to what people perceive, does not make them happier. Right? A funny little story in there, and I would recommend you watch his rendition because it's much more funny than I am, is he talks about the power of positive thinking, basically. So when he was young, he was playing with his little sister, who was 4 or 5 at the time, and they were playing on a bunk bed, on the top bunk of a bunk bed, and he was responsible. He was 7 or 8 at the time. He was responsible for his younger sister. And they were messing around, roughhousing on top of the bed, and his sister fell off the bunk bed, down onto her hands and knees on the floor, and he could tell that she was about to cry. And so he quickly jumps down and tries to think of something that will not cause her to cry and try and convince her that everything is okay. And so what popped into his head is to tell his sister that, oh my gosh, do you know what you just did? Only one animal can fall off of something that high and land on all fours, and it's a unicorn. And he could see in his sister's eyes that she was very conflicted, that on one hand she was in great pain and suffering and wanted nothing more than to cry out. But at the same time, she had this great joy that she might be a unicorn. And the unicorn went out and they went back to playing, and later on they found out her arm was broken and he got in trouble anyway. But it's amazing to think that in a circumstance where you were in such pain, that something as simple as an imaginary animal could change your perspective and allow you to be happy through that. So when we look at our own lives, we often go through a great deal of suffering. Maybe not from falling off a bunk bed, but through a divorce, a loss of a job, a loss of money, something that happens to us physically. And we have to figure out a way to recover our happiness. And if something as simple as a unicorn, right, for a kid, that would make sense, can do that, maybe there's a way for us to do that. And so I would say that there is. So back to Dan Gilbert. So he's the one that brought up that quiz, right, between being paralyzed and winning the lottery. So we have this thing called impact bias. We predict that the impact of an event will be greater than it is, and we tend to very much overestimate that for positive things. We think a positive thing will have a much greater impact on our happiness and well-being than it actually will. And we tend to underestimate the negative things that will happen to us because we tend to think that we're all above average, right? Which statistically does not make sense. And again, that we can return to this psychological immune system, this state of kind of balance within our happiness. And so, taking that kind of in conjunction with what Sean Achor was saying, that happy people are actually better, that we actually have to change our mind to build our happiness. And so Dan Gilbert talks about synthetic happiness, the happiness that we create. And basically, happiness is a practice. Much like we build our physical fitness over time, or we build our immune system by taking vaccines and building the immune system up, or exposure over time in our lives to different things, right? That builds up our immune system in those different ways. It builds up our body's resilience to injury because we built the sinews and the muscles that protect us from those things. We can do the same thing with our mental abilities, happiness, even memory. Like there are some great studies that you can actually increase your memory, your functional memory, by a huge amount by practicing. Great thing about the brain is it's very elastic, very adaptable. And one important thing to consider before we get into the actual practice piece of happiness is that there is no such thing as permanent happiness, right? The variability that we experience as humans, the times of sadness, give us the baseline that help us maintain the perspective for when we should be happy, right? Or when we realize that we actually have enough and that life is actually really good and we have much to be grateful for. So the fact that we've gone through sad times, or even if we're currently going through sad times, does not mean that we cannot recover that level of happiness. In fact, usually it helps us to be happier. I know in my life I have been through many struggles, some of them pretty severe. And those severe times have allowed me to realize that my life is wonderful. People, my wife sometimes gives me a hard time she thinks I'm maybe overly optimistic at times. But to me, it's hard to not be, considering what I've been through. And so I think it's those challenging times that really give us that perspective, and that leads us to our next bit. Perspective is what sets our happiness baseline. If you've never experienced anything bad, you might think that your life isn't that good, right? Because it's just kind of the same. Just mediocre, maybe it's the same as everybody else. You might think, well, I guess this sucks, or it's good. I'm not sure. I don't have a perspective to look at this from. But if we take time to listen, we can often learn perspective from each other. I would not wish some of the experiences I've had on other people. I'll share some of them with you shortly. And so I want to share them because I want people to really put themselves in my shoes and in the shoes of people who are different and in the shoes of people who have gone through something hard, so that they might be able to glean a little bit of perspective that helps to set their happiness baseline a little bit better. Otherwise, the only way to gain experience or gain perspective is through experience. And there are a lot of experiences out there that you don't want to have, like being paralyzed, that we hope that we can learn from them as opposed to going through it ourselves. But those are kind of the two ways. I remember hearing a great piece of advice from someone, I can't remember who now, somebody famous, when asking on how you build empathy, right? And empathy is basically just understanding someone else's perspective, right? And they said the single greatest thing you can do is to travel. And to travel to places that put you in a little bit of discomfort. Because that will give you the perspective to understand other people. Same thing with happiness. Putting yourself out there, understanding people, being open to their experiences will help you gain the perspective to establish a happiness baseline. And then that discomfort, right? Comfort is the opposite of growth. I believe that very much to be true. Comfort is the opposite of growth. If you are comfortable, if everything is just right, you are not growing or learning. If you're not challenged, if you're not struggling, you're not getting better. So, just a small struggle. I work full time. I do this because I think it's important. We're also hosting a dinner at our house tonight, and I don't really want to do all of those things at the same time, right? It would be much more comfortable to just do the one thing I'm required to do. But I've established for myself that these things are important, and they serve as motivators for me to get out and do the things that aren't comfortable for me, but cause growth for me, and hopefully growth for other people as well, right? But there are always times that we face this, oh man, I'm so tired, I would just love to sit back and do nothing. And those times, you do need those times, right? There are wellness days. You need to take a break, and you need to get some sleep, and you need to take care of yourself and just zone out for a day. That's totally cool. Meditation is all about that, and there's a lot of goodness behind it. But when we do that for too long, then we're hindering our own growth, or we're actually going backwards. So when it comes to happiness, sometimes our discomfort is good because it helps us gain that perspective. So now I want to share with you some stories from my time in Afghanistan. So I was deployed in Afghanistan to a place called Kunar Province. If you've ever seen the movie Restrepo, that took place in that province. It's not a particularly safe place. It's on the border of Pakistan, right on the next to the tribal areas that were a little bit less well regulated in Pakistan. And I had some amazing experiences there that have given me the most wonderful gift of perspective, but I would never wish it upon anyone else. The first thing I want to share with you is about the families there. You would think for a place that has been war-torn for so long and has so little that those people would be miserable, right? If we went by the kind of conventional idea of happiness, they have very little. Their circumstances are very bad, very dangerous. When you look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they have very few of those things, kind of even in the basic level. And yet, even there, I found happiness and laughter and joy. So one of the things I did was go out and take pictures, just of the countryside, of the people, of different developmental projects going on there. And I have these pictures of these Afghan children at a school playing a game which is like a very strange version of Red Rover, running around on the rocks with no shoes and having a wonderful time. And I had pictures at that same school of two kids who weren't even attending the school, they were just there goofing around, and just making funny faces at the camera and having fun with each other. They seemed like regular kids, smiling and laughing. That's not what you picture when you think of Afghanistan. If I walked up to anyone in the world and just said Afghanistan, they would think, you know, Al-Qaeda and Taliban, terrorism, bombs, military. But that's not what I saw. What I mostly saw was a green valley. And I saw children having a good time. And I saw families that wanted exactly the same thing that we do. They want safety for their kids. They want opportunities for jobs and to provide for their families. They just want to be happy. And so people think, well, they must be very different than we are, and they are not. The differences between they had Mountain Dew in Afghanistan. I swear to you, Mountain Dew. They actually, I think they drank soda more than they drank water, but they had Mountain Dew in 2-liter bottles and after 3-liter bottles even, I think, in Afghanistan, and I was completely shocked by that. There are far more similarities between me and anybody in the world than there are differences. So that's one. So the families and the children. The second was combat. We were driving back from an event in that province, and my truck got hit by an IED. And I remember thinking in that moment, "You've got to be shitting me." I was the only Air Force person on that truck at the time in the middle of nowhere of Afghanistan. It's not really what my job description was. And that experience, and then just like a month later, a mortar landed very, very close to where my wooden shack was. And I actually thought it initially had killed the wooden shack next to me. There were 4 people in there. Thankfully it didn't. It didn't hurt anybody, miraculously, but that was a good thing. But those two experiences together made me realize that life is very, very fragile. Anything could happen to any of us. I could be driving home today and somebody crashes into me, and that would be it. And so it made me realize and focus on the things that are important in life, which to me personally is family. I love my family very much, and I want to make the world a better place for them. And so that has allowed me to understand that while I do get frustrated when the internet goes out, that is not necessarily something that I want to let ruin my day. And we have all of these first world problems, and we joke about it, right? First world problems. But a lot of times we let consume us because we don't have necessarily the baseline, like, almost being blown up in Afghanistan, to set for us. So I would offer that piece to you to think about. And one of the sayings I use that one of my bosses used to hate is, "No one's shooting at us today." And it seems kind of silly because it seems extreme, but a lot of people live in those circumstances and yet still find joy in their lives. There's a great story. I was able to listen to a POW who was in the Hanoi Hilton during Vietnam. And the thing that struck me most about his story was the fact that they told jokes, and that they realized after being there that humor was one of their greatest weapons against the mental stress of being there. So he told me a story. The person in the adjacent cell to him knocked on his wall. So if you're not familiar with the tap code, I recommend you look it up. It's very interesting. Started tapping on the wall, and they tapped messages to each other so the guards couldn't understand what they were saying. And the guy was basically saying, "Hey, is anyone there? I have an issue." So the guy taps back, "Okay, what is your issue?" "I have a snake in my room." And so the guy taps back, "Who is this?" And the first guy said, with the snake in his room, said, "This is John McCain." So his cellmate was now Senator John McCain. And he says, "Oh, you have a snake in your room? That's too bad. I have a giant tarantula in my room. Would you like to trade?" And so McCain taps back, "I would definitely prefer the spider over the snake." Right? So even in those circumstances, they're making jokes, first of all, about having dangerous animals in their room, while they're prisoners of war in a terrible camp in the middle of Vietnam. Isn't that mind-boggling to think about? That's what they were, because they had nothing else to do. And so humor was something that helped them get through. So even in that time, they allowed themselves to be happy and found ways to do it, which I think is absolutely incredible. And then the last piece is death. So in Afghanistan, I was responsible for moving people from helicopters to taking them off the helicopter when they were evacuated from the battlefield, and our base was the first place they went. We had a surgical room there. And so I was responsible for getting litter teams up there to get them off the helicopter and bring them in. And one of the, so unfortunately we had more than 100 people come in injured, and then we had, I think, 5 who were killed during my time there. And so I actually had to bring people who had died and were still warm from the battlefield and bring them to the surgical room to have the flag draped over them and be sent home. Which is in itself quite the experience and really emphasizes the fragility of life. But I also remember a guy who got injured. He was a pararescue guy out on a mission, and when you have night vision goggles on, you don't really have great depth perception. And while walking with night vision goggles on, he walked off a cliff. And he fell about 15 to 20 feet into what luckily was a swamp. So it kind of broke his fall a little bit softer. And so we're bringing this guy in, huge guy by the way, very heavy. And he's making jokes about how silly it is for this pararescue guy to get injured by walking off a cliff in Afghanistan, right? They're out there to fight bad guys and rescue people and bring them back, and he walks off a cliff. And he's just like, oh man, what? He's like laughing, but also hurt because his ribs are broken. And just cracking fun about how silly it is that he walked off a cliff in Afghanistan. I'm sure he got a great nickname after that. But that was striking to me. And to be fair, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the folks that work in the Special Forces have that level of resilience because they understand that life is fragile, right? And so they've built this kind of this humor, this resilience to bad situations, and that was his response, to laugh at walking off a cliff in Afghanistan. So those things stick out to me. And when I'm having bad times, I try and remember those things. No one's shooting at me, right? Life is fragile. If I'm worrying about these things, I'm allowing myself to be unhappy about something very silly. And so I offer those to you, and I hope they're valuable to you in helping to reorient your perspective. And I think it's a very helpful thing. So we first talked about happiness, then we talked about perspective, how to set your baseline for happiness, but how do we practice it, right? What do you do on a daily basis to be happy? Well, I've got some research for you. The thing that we can do on a daily basis to be grateful, to practice gratitude. It's the thing that we can do to remind ourselves that there is something good in my life. So there's a good study out there. So Sean Acor mentions it. There's also, I'll put in the links, there's a Psychology Today kind of a roundup of different studies about being grateful and practicing happiness. But this study basically said that if you, at the end of the day, write down 3 new things that you're grateful for, after a month you will be measurably happier. So I would definitely challenge you all with this. So you can go out, the links I'm going to put in there, you can take that happiness inventory, right? So you can actually measure happiness today according to the inventory. Do this for a month. And then also at the end of every week, and I would say even starting at the beginning of the first week, journal, if that's what you want to do, journal how you feel. What do you think you're happy? Tell me about your happiness, or tell yourself about your happiness. Then at the end of the first week, after which you've thought about 3 new things every day that you're grateful for, write down again how you feel about your happiness. And do that for 4 weeks. And then come back. Or get online and tell us, do you feel better? And if it didn't work, that's okay. It's not magic. But let's practice it. Let's do the experiment. Right? And in doing so, ideally we actually get happier. And we build that resilience. So the next time we know, I'm not feeling good today. I'm not feeling happy. But I know if I can focus on 3 things to be grateful for, I'll be a little bit happier. Right? It's a specific skill that we can build and then share with others. Because if it works for us, that's where we put our house in order. And we say, hey, friend, Steve Bob, I was sad this one time, and I started doing this gratitude thing, and it seems kind of cheesy, but it actually worked. So, give it a shot. Then you've now helped that person. You've helped spread that skill that makes them happier. And so in that way are building that community and helping them make the world a better place. Now what this does kind of psychologically is it counteracts our negativity bias. We have this evolutionary thing that we focus on things that are negative. Because when we were in smaller tribes or even as individuals, we were looking for threats. We were looking for things that would harm us. And so looking at the negative stuff made sense. But in this world where we have so much, it doesn't make as much sense anymore. We actually have a lot more than even a lot of times what we need. And so we're still looking for negative things unless we focus on counteracting that. And that's what gratitude does. It helps us counter that negativity bias. And so our takeaway, as I mentioned, for the next month, do this. Write 1 to 3 things every day. 3 new things that you're grateful for in the day. And then let us know how you feel. And so we'll start now. I'd like for you to share one thing that you're grateful for that happened in the last week, and then also share one thing that you're looking forward to in the week to come. So do that now with each other.
Just turn.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you guys
Go ahead, Aaron.
I'm grateful for kind of late in the week. This
Friends,
just
first thing
gives
that happened
me
to the game
last night was fun with these guys. A community that I've actually been looking forward to something like that. So, one going forward.
This past week,
I would say
you
more
were
of these meetings.
Was that good?
Well,
That's a good thing, right?
and I'm grateful for my siblings.
I threw a
I mean,
bunch of
stars
stars.
by.
Isabella's here.
So that was pretty fun.
I am so grateful.
What are you guys doing next week? Are you doing
Next week,
Last week I had my ceremony of my citizenship.
next
Oh
week.
wow!
Yes,
An event?
so I'm,
Do you know what the event
Looking forward to
I'm
what?
from Small Republic.
The next one,
Are you just going to go to the
Oh,
live?
I
I love this.
All right.
Yeah,
Are you
no,
gonna go
every
to live?
Thursday.
Yeah.
in the summer.
So I'm
Yeah.
Russian.
What are you
Like
doing?
snap.
Oh, you're Russian.
Like I said,
Oh,
I'm
pretty
my
good.
force those are.
Oh, you said that. Okay. All right.
Oh, so much.
Oh yeah, I know a little bit. Just
Yeah.
a little bit, but not. I'm not
going
going
to
to
school.
study.
What'd y'all play?
You like going to school? It's not
I know the alphabet. I got the alphabet until
Cards
it's
for
one of my
humanity.
alphabets.
That's one of we
I've
have.
played that
We didn't
before.
play
I
Yeah,
had
I understand.
ceremony of
There's some things that we
authorization
can
last
tie
week.
But if we keep
And,
practicing and learn them, then it's easier.
My good friend,
It's just like
Andrew's wife,
just like
Jen,
swimming.
she threw a
We used to not
party,
be able to swim,
surprise
and then we
me
practiced
with
it a bunch.
party.
So imagine it's the same.
I've seen
My
cards.
ceremony
I've
was
played cards.
fun.
That's
and
great.
You
That's
get
right.
pretty
Learn
bad.
it. 'Cause
I looked at
sometimes
the way the
Yeah.
cards and
Yeah.
there's easy what the game was
So
about.
That happens to me too,
because
so
I go
sometimes I have
through
to figure it differently.
difficult
Yeah.
Oh
time.
yeah,
Did you
you
see
must
the
be
video
getting
game?
that. You're coming
It was-
from
Maybe ask your mom.
a place
It's
like
fun.
Earth.
It's fun.
She's
She's
right.
right.
It's a whole,
You know that?
you know.
Yeah,
it's just
I
very
travel
good.
a lot.
So
Yeah.
you could ask
Wow,
her.
that's great. I'm happy to have you. Like,
She used to teach kids math.
Have you made trivia night
Yeah,
yet?
I'm so grateful
So you
for
guys do it was
last week
stay.
citizenship.
Sounds
They
good.
go down there.
I
Really?
Yeah, it was
surrounded
several weeks ago.
with so
Oh, okay.
positive people.
Mhm.
All right.
But
That's
they
really
did it
great. That's
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
Oh, they had good hamburgers.
It's kind of smoky too, though.
All right, so is anyone willing to share what they're grateful for in the last week and what they're looking forward to in the next week?
Next week, I got to think.
Who's just grateful for something last week?
Me?
Okay, what were you grateful for?
For my citizenship. Yeah, I had a ceremony of naturalization last week, so I'm proud American now.
Very good.
Congratulations.
Yeah, and I didn't feel that so well until Jen, Andrew's wife, threw surprise party, and I was surrounded so positive people, and I was feeling that love and support. I was like shocked because first time in my life I had surprise party. Yeah, so
Yeah,
That
so
was-
citizenship is a very cool thing. So
Yes.
we were glad that you could get that.
yeah, it's a big
That was
step
great.
in my life. Yeah, I have like steps, and it's another step, and I'm going forward.
Yeah.
So I'm so grateful for that.
That is excellent.
Oh, yeah.
For next week, I'm just trying to work on my situation, and I'm so happy to be here
Good.
because
I'm glad.
it's something what I needed.
Good. I'm gonna check the video real quick. Jen is calling me. Nope, still going. Okay. All right, who else?
I'm thankful for, again, like I've already kind of expressed, groups like this, meetings like this, because it's something, like I said, that really, has come up in my life, and I really needed, I think, because this, to me, I think this, things like this type of thought, skepticism and stuff like that, is really needed, and it's really good, for people, just, being honest, and for people like the, atheists and agnostics and people in that sense that, we really, in a lot of ways, don't have community and stuff like that, and it's really good that we have this and stuff like that. I think that's just really a good thing, so I'm really thankful for this, and I get to meet all of you wonderful people, and be here today, so.
Don't worry about it happening. Thanks for coming.
Well, telling Eric, I'm grateful for my siblings. My parents went into hospice
Okay.
last week, and I'm the youngest of 5, so it's helped. Even though there's only 2 of us in town, 3 live out of town, but the one furthest away lives in Italy, and he flew in, and
wow.
it's just it's a good support group. Having my siblings there, with me, and for next week, I'm looking forward to the fun run every Thursday, fun run summertime, and anyway, looking forward to that.
I'm grateful for this group, and the game night last night was a riot,
Game night was a lot of fun last night.
and looking forward to my divorce, possibly next week, or
Okay.
at least getting things signed.
A little bit of closure.
Yeah, it is a closure.
Well, thank you all for coming today. Thank you for sharing. I think it is very important. Oh, I guess I should share. So what I'm most grateful for in the last week is my wife, which is usually the case, but particularly so this last week because she set up some events, and I'm not, surprisingly, the most social person, and so she'll set up things for me